So that book, like some of my others, was loosely inspired by real events. The Chowchilla school bus kidnapping. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's a real event that mirrors some of what happened in the novel. It was an entire bus full of children that were abducted while they were trying to get them home from school, and they not to give any spoilers away, but things got worse from there. So I that happened back pre-internet, pre-cell phones. And when I heard that, it's such a, like you said, it's a terrifying thing to think children on a school bus coming home could be all of a sudden in the worst possible situation. Because we do think of school buses and, heading home from school is a time that should be pretty safe, especially for little kids. But I like just that story got stuck in my head and I wanted to know, like, could that happen in a modern setting? Like, what would that play out as if, someone was going to do the same thing in the era of cell phones and GPS? And that really got the wheels turning that, yeah, like I think it could get in the right situations. And then I watched documentaries about Chowchilla, doing all my research, and I watched some really wonderful documentaries about it, but the thing that struck me the most is that the bus driver kind of was billed as playing this really heroic role in the real story, and he did, but the kids didn't get nearly enough credit for what they did to get themselves out of that horrifying situation, and I really wanted to give the kids more credit for what had happened in some small way in my fictionalized version of what could have happened in a modern setting. So I really thought about that as I set out to write that book. Like, you've got this ticking clock, these children who've been abducted in this most horrifying way, and then give pointing a light on how heroic those kids really were, to change that situation from an absolute nightmare to one in which they, not to give spoilers, but I know that some people don't want to read a book in which some, depending if there's children involved. So, yes, this book is a safe one for you to read, but, that's all I'll say if you're wondering about Such Quiet Girls. I interviewed a couple of school bus drivers or people who had at least done it for a little while. But I did remember that experience of being on the Wild West school bus too. Like, it's different now. The buses are a little less, wild card environments, but I do still think that that position is not as highly regarded as it should be, probably for how many, the stakes of carrying these children to and from home. My kids have both had a couple of school bus drivers that all of a sudden got yanked from their route. And then they were telling me these stories about what happened on the bus. And it's like, even now, it's there's still some volatility in that school bus zone. Like, it's still, you've got a lot of kids, you've got, districts with budgets that they're trying to meet, and they're trying to fill positions. And so sometimes you do end up with a mismatch of someone who should be in that position. But that's not exactly the case in my book. I wanted Jessa, who is our school bus driver, I wanted her to be a kind, good-hearted person, but to kind of be coming from her own trauma and rough situation. So I wanted this to feel like just a job to her at first. I wanted it to be like, this is just a box to check. This job's going to get me from point A to point B. And to have it, the gravity of what that situation really means and that responsibility on her shoulders to really hit hard as the situation spirals out of control. So Sage and Bonnie, they're two sisters. Sage is a point of view protagonist that we've got, and she's the oldest kid on the bus, and she's got her little sister there with her who she's a little annoyed by, but as the situation unfolds, they get closer together, and they have to rely on each other. But her little sister Bonnie doesn't get a ton of screen time, but she really warmed her way into my heart. And I love Bonnie. She's brave in her own ways, and she's just a, tiny little kid, and thought about a lot of those little kids that were on that real school bus in Chowchilla. And there were a lot more than in my novel. I pared the number down just so we didn't get too overwhelmed with the cast of characters. But yeah, I kind of fell in love with Bonnie. She was a sweet girl.